The sound of footsteps entered the compound before Ngozi did, slow, uncertain, heavier than they had ever been in all the years she had walked through that same gate as a wife. By the time she stepped inside, people were already standing outside their doors watching, whispering quietly as if something important was about to happen. And then she saw Ikechukwu, her husband, standing at the entrance of their house beside another woman, Amarachi, dressed as if she already belonged there, while the same bench, where he used to call Ngozi to sit near him, suddenly looked like a place that no longer had space for her. Ngozi's hands began to shake, but she did not cry, she did not speak. She only stood there in the middle of the compound where everyone could see her, while even the elder women who had always told her to endure marriage kept silent that day. What Ngozi did not know, as she swallowed that humiliation in front of everyone, was that years later something would walk back through that same compound gate in a way nobody there ever expected. Sit back as we uncover what truly returned to that compound years later. There is a particular kind of love that does not announce itself loudly. It does not arrive with music or celebration. It arrives quietly, wearing the face of sacrifice, and it settles into the corners of a life so completely that the person living that life sometimes forgets it, is even there until the day it is threatened. That was the kind of love Ngozi brought into Ikechukwu's compound. She had come to him as a young woman of 23, not wealthy, not connected to any powerful family, but carrying something that older women in her village recognized immediately. The kind of character that holds a household together when everything else is trying to pull it apart. Her mother had raised her in a home where the kitchen fire never went out before everyone had eaten. Her father had shown her, by example, what it meant to carry your name carefully through the world. And Ngozi, who had watched both of them closely throughout her childhood, arrived at Ikechukwu's gate, already knowing what marriage required, before it had asked anything of her. Ikechukwu was 31 when they married. He was not yet the man the compound would later come to know. In those early years, he was still trying, still showing up to family meetings with the posture of someone who needed to prove himself, still calculating whether the money from his small transport business would last through the month. The compound he inherited from his father had not yet been painted. 2 of the rooms had roofing that let in water when the rain fell heavily, and the relatives who now filled his yard on festive occasions were far less visible in those days when there was little to celebrate. Ngozi did not mind any of it. She plastered the walls of their main room herself, mixing the compound with her own hands because the man they had hired did not show up, and she refused to let another week pass with the wall crumbling. She learned to manage money in a way that made small amounts stretch further than they had any right to stretch. When Ikechukwu came home tired and discouraged after a vehicle broke down or a business arrangement fell through, she did not add to his worry with complaints. She fed him, sat near him on the bench outside their door, and spoke to him in the quiet, steady way that reminded him what he was working toward. The compound noticed Mama Ugochi, who lived in the far room nearest the back wall and had watched many marriages form and fracture within that same yard, once told a neighbour that Ngozi was the kind of woman who holds a man's future in her hands without him realising it. It was meant as a compliment. At the time, it was received as one. But the compound also carried something else beneath its surface, a set of unspoken expectations that every wife eventually discovered, some sooner than others. There were elder women who believed that a woman's position in a marriage was only as secure as the children she produced. There were relatives who arrived infrequently, but spoke loudly when they did. And there was an entire architecture of opinion and influence that moved quietly through family conversations, shifting perceptions about who deserved what, who had fulfilled their role, and who had somehow fallen short of what a marriage was supposed to produce. For the first several years, Ngozi navigated all of it with a steadiness that impressed even those who were quietly watching for weakness. She greeted every relative with the correct level of respect. She sent food to the elder women during festivals without being asked. She kept the domestic peace of the compound in a way that required constant invisible labour, the kind that is only noticed when it suddenly stops. And through all of it, she waited. She waited for the children who were slow in coming. She visited doctors quietly, without broadcasting her concern to the compound, because she understood that in a place where walls have ears and silence has interpretations, discretion was its own form of protection. She prayed with the faith of a woman who had learned that results were not always delivered on the schedule that prayers requested. And she held on to the belief, quietly but firmly, that her place inside this marriage was secure because she had earned it, not just with her body, but with every single day of her presence, her patience, and her labour. What she did not yet understand was that earning something and being allowed to keep it are not always the same thing. The pressure about children began arriving in whispers first. A comment from a visiting aunt here, a pointed question from an elder woman there. Then the whispers became conversations that Ngozi was not included in. Then the conversations became decisions that arrived fully formed without her input, carrying the weight of family consensus that nobody had openly consulted her to build. And Ikechukwu, the man who had sat beside her on that bench during the difficult years, the man whose walls she had plastered with her own hands, the man who had once told her that she was the reason the compound finally felt like a home, began listening to different voices. It happened gradually, the way most painful things do. Not in a single moment that could be pointed to and challenged, but in an accumulation of small changes that each seemed minor on its own. He stopped discussing certain decisions with her before making them. He began visiting relatives more frequently without explaining what was being discussed. He grew quieter in the evenings, not with the comfortable silence of a man who was simply tired, but with the distant silence of a man who was carrying something he had decided she would not be part of. Ngozi noticed all of it. She said nothing, because she had been taught that patience was the most powerful tool a woman could carry inside a marriage. She endured, because the elder women she trusted most kept telling her that endurance in difficult seasons was what separated the women who ultimately triumphed from those who left too early and regretted it later. She stayed because she genuinely believed that the man she had helped build from his struggling years would remember, when the noise around him quieted, who had actually stood beside him. She was still believing this on the afternoon Ikechukwu brought Amarachi home. There are moments that do not announce themselves as turning points while they are happening. You only understand what they truly were later, when you are standing somewhere quieter, with enough distance to see the full shape of what occurred. The afternoon Amarachi arrived was not quiet. Ngozi had been away visiting her younger sister, who had recently given birth and needed assistance with the first difficult weeks of motherhood. She had told Ikechukwu she would be gone for 4 days. She returned on the 3rd because a feeling she could not name clearly, a restlessness that arrived in the middle of the night and refused to let her sleep, pulled her back earlier than planned. She entered the compound the way she always had, through the main gate, carrying a bag on her shoulder and the easy familiarity of a woman returning to her own home. The footsteps that entered before her were slow only because she was tired from the journey. The uncertainty in them was something only those already watching would have noticed. But they were watching. Almost everyone in the compound was outside, some sweeping, some seated, some finding reasons to be visible in the yard that had nothing to do with whatever task they claimed to be performing. Ngozi registered their presence the way you register a change in temperature before you can identify its source. Something in the air felt different. Something in the way eyes moved toward her, and then quickly away told her that the compound had already been informed of something she had not yet been told. And then she saw them. Ikechukwu stood at the entrance of their house, her house, the house whose walls she had plastered, whose kitchen she had managed for more than a decade, with the posture of a man who had already made a decision and was now simply waiting for the acknowledgement to arrive. Beside him stood a young woman in a wrapper that was too carefully chosen for an ordinary afternoon. She stood close enough to him that the distance between them communicated a relationship, and she looked at Ngozi the way someone looks at a situation they have already been briefed about and are now watching unfold in real time. Amarachi. Ngozi did not know her name yet. She would learn it within the hour, from the same elder women who had always counselled her patience and who now stood in their doorways wearing expressions that mixed pity with something she could not immediately identify, relief, perhaps, that they were not the ones standing in the middle of the yard. The bench was right there. The bench where Ikechukwu had called her to sit beside him during all the years when the compound was smaller and the nights were quieter and the world outside their gate had not yet complicated everything between them. It was still in its usual place. But Amarachi's wrapper, folded neatly over one end of it, transformed the object from a shared memory into a declaration. Ngozi stood in the centre of the compound and understood everything in approximately 4 seconds. Her hands shook. Not with fear, she was not afraid of Amarachi, or of Ikechukwu, or of the watching eyes that were pretending not to watch. They shook with the effort of containing something enormous inside a body that had not been given warning, that had not been allowed to prepare, that was being asked to absorb a humiliation so public and so deliberate that even the neighbour's child, who could not have been older than 7, had stopped playing to stare. She did not cry. She did not speak. She stood there for what felt like a very long time and allowed the compound to see exactly what had been done to her, because she understood instinctively that collapsing or screaming would transform the narrative from what Ikechukwu had done into what Ngozi had become. She would not give the compound that story. She would give them only the truth of what she was. A woman standing in the middle of her own home, in front of her own people, being shown, without apology, that the years she had invested had been quietly reassessed and found insufficient. Then she walked past both of them into the house, set her bag down, and began making dinner, because she was still the woman of that house, and she intended for everyone to remember it. After Amarachi settled in, the compound reorganized itself around the new arrangement the way compounds always do, not all at once, but in a series of small adjustments that each seemed reasonable individually and devastating collectively. The first thing Ngozi lost was priority. It was subtle initially. When relatives visited and gifts were distributed, the order in which they were received began to shift. When decisions about shared resources were discussed, firewood, water allocation, space in the cooking area, Ngozi found herself being consulted less and informed more. Ikechukwu did not do this dramatically. He did it the way people do things they know are wrong but have convinced themselves are necessary, with a quietness that was designed to make protests seem excessive. Mama Nkechi, who occupied the room nearest the compound entrance and who had been Ngozi's most consistent source of counsel since her first year in the yard, continued to advise patience. She had a saying she returned to frequently, that truth inside a marriage is like water finding its level. It may be pressed down in one place, but it will always surface somewhere, eventually. She said it with the conviction of a woman who had survived her own difficult seasons and arrived at a place of peace, and Ngozi found genuine comfort in it, even when the circumstances made it difficult to believe. But Mama Ugochi was different. Mama Ugochi did not offer advice often. She was older than Mama Nkechi, quieter in the ways that mattered, and she had a way of watching compound situations with an attention that suggested she was tracking something specific beneath the visible surface of events. After Amarachi arrived, Mama Ugochi's watching became more focused. She began sitting outside her room at the hours when the yard was most active. She listened carefully to conversations without appearing to participate in them. And once or twice, Ngozi caught her looking in the direction of the main gate with an expression that was not quite anticipation, but was not quite calm either. When Ngozi once asked her what she was thinking about, Mama Ugochi said only, "Some things that people put outside the compound do not stay outside." Ngozi did not know what to do with that. She stored it away without fully understanding it. The way you store something you recognize is important before you know why. Meanwhile, Amarachi's integration into the compound produced its own complications that the elders had not anticipated when they encouraged Ikechukwu's decision. She was younger than Ngozi, yes, and more willing to perform the kind of visibility that pleased certain relatives appearing at family gatherings with enthusiasm, speaking loudly of her admiration for the family's traditions, maintaining a posture of deference in public settings that caused elder women to nod approvingly. But she was also perceptive enough to understand that her position, despite the ceremony and the support, was built on an architecture that had cracks in it. The crack she sensed most clearly, but could not yet see the full shape of. The name nobody said, Chisom. It appeared occasionally in conversations that stopped abruptly when certain people noticed Ngozi was nearby. It surfaced in a comment an elder woman made about the child the family lost track of before being quickly redirected into a different subject. It existed in the careful silence that Mama Ugochi maintained whenever the topic of the family's history came up in compound discussions. Ngozi had heard the name twice in her years in the compound before Amarachi arrived, and both times the reaction of those around her had been the same: a sudden stillness, a rapid change of subject, and a lingering tension that lasted longer than the conversation that had produced it. She had asked Ikechukwu once, early in their marriage, whose name it was. He had told her it was someone from his family's past who was no longer relevant, and the way he said it with a finality that was not quite peace had told her that asking again would cost more than the answer was worth. So she had not asked again. But she had not forgotten. And as the years passed inside the compound, and the pressure and the humiliation and the slow erosion of the position she had built with her own hands continued, the name Chizom began returning to her mind with a frequency that felt less like coincidence and more like preparation. Preparation for what? She did not yet know. It was during the dry season when the quarrel happened. Family meetings in that compound were not unusual. Ikechukwu's extended family was large and opinionated, and they gathered regularly under the mango tree in the yard with an enthusiasm that suggested they genuinely enjoyed the process of discussing one another's business. Ngozi had attended many of them over the years. She had learned how to read the room, which elder to watch for signals about which way a discussion was heading, which younger relative's loudness was performance and which indicated genuine feeling, when a conversation that appeared to be about one subject was actually about another entirely. The meeting that afternoon had been called to discuss the question of property. Specifically, it had been called to discuss the formal registration of the compound and the land it sat on, which Ikechukwu's father had never completed before his death, and which now existed in a legal ambiguity that relatives had different opinions about how to resolve. On the surface, it was a practical matter. Beneath the surface, it was a negotiation about who held power in the family and who would continue to hold it going forward. These were the meetings Ngozi had always attended carefully, because she understood that practical matters involving property in a family like this one were never purely practical. The discussion began orderly and became heated the way these things do slowly, then suddenly, two of Ikechukwu's uncles disagreed about the procedure. A cousin who had returned from the city with modern opinions about legal registration said things that the elder men received poorly. Voices rose, positions hardened. And in the middle of the escalation, when one of the uncles was making an impassioned argument about what the family's father had intended, he said something that silenced the entire gathering. He said, "And this is why the matter of the first child must be settled before anything else is registered in anyone's name." The yard went silent in a particular way. Not the silence of confusion. Everyone present understood what had been referenced. It was the silence of people who had individually hoped this subject would not surface in a public meeting and were now adjusting to the reality that it had. Ngozi watched the faces around her with the attention of a woman who had learned to read the compound silences, and what she saw made her heart beat with a strange double rhythm. The familiar compression of someone absorbing a new blow, and beneath it, something else entirely. The first full breath of a question that had been waiting years for someone to ask it out loud. The first child. The meeting dissolved without resolution, which was its own kind of resolution. People dispersed back to their rooms with the careful body language of individuals who had said too much or heard too much and needed time alone to process both. The uncle who had spoken was surrounded immediately by two of the older men and guided away from the yard in a conversation clearly designed to be private. Ikechukwu did not look at Ngozi as people dispersed. That too told her something. She went back to her room and sat on the edge of her bed in the hot afternoon, and for the first time in years, She allowed herself to think clearly about the name she had stored away without fully examining. Chisom, a child, a first child, apparently. A matter that needed to be settled before property could be registered in anyone's name. She thought about Mama Ugochi's words. Some things that people put outside the compound do not stay outside. And she waited. Years passed inside the compound. Not quietly, years. In a compound like that one never pass quietly, but with the particular rhythm of time that does not announce its own passing. Seasons changed. Relatives were born and died. Children who had been small the afternoon Ngozi returned early from her sister's house and found her marriage rearranged in her absence, grew tall enough to look her in the eye. The mango tree, under which family decisions were made and unmade, continued to spread its branches across the same yard where those decisions played out. Ngozi's position settled into something she had not anticipated and had taken some time to understand. A kind of dignity through endurance that was different from the triumphant vindication the elder women had always promised, but was real in its own quieter way. She was still in the compound. She had not been displaced. The years of her labour were not invisible to everyone. Mama Nkechi spoke of her with a respect that younger women in the yard noticed and absorbed. And the invisible work of maintaining a household, which Ngozi had performed for so many years that it had become like breathing, continued to make her presence felt in the compound in ways that could not be attributed to anyone else. Amarachi's confidence, meanwhile, had matured into something more complicated than the bright certainty she had arrived with. She had produced children something the compound had clearly expected of her, and their presence gave her a security of a practical kind. But the deeper security she had perhaps imagined, the sense of being the unquestioned centre of a family's story, had not fully materialised. There were too many undiscussed things in the compound's history for anyone's position to feel entirely settled. Too many questions that had been carefully avoided for too many years. And Amarachi, who was perceptive enough to feel the shape of what she could not yet see clearly, lived with a low-level awareness that something in the family's past was unresolved in a way that might eventually matter to her future. Ikechukwu aged. The transport business had grown and then contracted and then grown again in a different form. He had become the kind of man the compound deferred to in family meetings, older, heavier in the way of men who have stopped worrying about their physical presence, carrying the authority that accumulates in a person simply through the passage of time and the occupying of a consistent position. But those who watched him closely, Ngozi, certainly, and Mama Ugochi, without question, could see that he carried something else as well. A weight that was not business and was not family politics. Something older. Something he had put outside the compound many years before and had been telling himself, ever since, was no longer his to carry. Mama Ugochi continued watching the gate. It was an ordinary morning when the gate opened. The kind of morning in a compound like that one, when the yard is alive with the overlapping sounds of daily life, a child crying in one room, a woman singing softly in another, the clatter of cooking utensils, the distant sound of traffic from the road. Nobody was watching the gate particularly. Nobody had been told to expect anything, and then she walked through it. She was young, perhaps 22 or 23, and she carried herself with the particular confidence of someone who has rehearsed the moment they are in and arrived at it fully prepared. She was not dressed to impress, but she was dressed deliberately. Neat, intentional, the clothing of a person who understood that appearance communicates before words do. She stopped inside the gate and looked around the compound with eyes that were doing something more specific than simply taking in an unfamiliar space. She was looking for something she already knew the shape of. The compound noticed her the way it had once noticed Ngozi returning early from her sister's house, a gradual orientation of attention, a stopping of small activities, a gathering of presence that preceded understanding. Children stopped. Women in doorways paused. The man who had been repairing the gate hinge set down his tool. Mama Ugochi stood up. This was what people would remember later, that before anyone else responded, before anyone else even processed what they were seeing, Mama Ugochi rose from her chair outside her room with the unhurried certainty of a woman who had been waiting for exactly this and was entirely unsurprised by its arrival. She crossed the compound slowly. She stopped in front of the young woman. She looked at her face for a long moment, the particular looking of someone confirming what they already know, and then she turned to the compound, to the gathering of faces in doorways and the stilled bodies in the yard, and she said the name, Chisom. The story that came out that morning in Ikechukwu's compound was not simple. Stories that have been kept silent for many years rarely are. They arrive with the full weight of everything that was done to suppress them, and they require time and space to fully unfold. But the essential shape of it was this. Before Ngozi, before the compound had been painted, before the roofing was repaired, before the transport business, before any of it, there had been a girl. A girl Ikechukwu had been with in the years before his marriage, when he was still very young and still moving between his village and the city, still figuring out what kind of man he intended to become. The girl had become pregnant. And in the way of young men who are not ready for the weight that life has handed them, Ikechukwu had done something that he would spend the next 2 decades telling himself was not as serious as it sounded when stated plainly, he had arranged for the situation to be handled. Not handled cruelly, as these things sometimes were, but handled quietly. The girl sent to relatives, the pregnancy managed, the child eventually placed with a family member in a distant state and not spoken of in the compound, except that one child had not been placed. The girl's mother had kept her, had raised her herself, had told her, when the time was right, exactly who her father was and exactly where to find him, and had finally, when the girl was old enough to make her own decisions, given her the address of a compound in a town not far away, and told her, when you are ready, that is where you go. Chisom had waited until she was ready. She had done her preparation carefully, gathering the documentation that confirmed what she was claiming, finding the elder who had been present at the original arrangement and who had never fully made his peace with how it was handled, connecting with Mama Ugochi, who had known fragments of the story for years and had maintained her quiet watching from a sense of obligation to a truth that deserved eventually to surface. The compound listened. Ikechukwu listened. Amarachi, who had positioned herself at the edge of the gathering with the careful stillness of someone absorbing information that was reorganizing the foundations of everything she thought she understood about her situation, listened. And Ngozi, who had endured the bench with Amarachi's wrapper on it, who had plastered walls and stretched small money and swallowed public humiliation without crying, who had stored the name Chisom away in a quiet corner of her mind years before, and waited, without knowing exactly what she was waiting for, Ngozi stood near the back of the gathering and listened with an expression that those who watched her described differently, depending on who they asked. Some said she looked sad, some said she looked relieved. Mama Nkechi, who knew her best, said she looked like a woman who had always known, somewhere beneath the knowing she was allowed to act on, that the compound's story was not yet finished. The days that followed Chisom's arrival were not comfortable. Comfortable resolutions are for stories that have been tidy from the beginning. Ikechukwu's compound had never been tidy, and the reckoning it faced now was proportional to the years of silence that had preceded it. There were family meetings that lasted into the evening. There were conversations between elders that were overheard and repeated and distorted and then slowly corrected back toward what had actually been said. There were relatives who had encouraged Ikechukwu's second marriage, whose advice had contributed to the afternoon. Ngozi stood in the yard and shook without crying, who now sat with the discomfort of having pushed toward an arrangement without knowing the full history that arrangement was built on top of. Because Chisom's existence as the first child changed things, not legally, in the simple sense that everyone initially panicked about, but in the more durable sense of what the family understood itself to be. The property question that had gone unresolved since Ikechukwu's father's death now carried an additional dimension. The family's self-narrative, who they were, what they owed to whom, what the past had actually consisted of, required revision, and in the middle of all of it, Ikechukwu faced something that no meeting and no elder and no arrangement of the compound could handle on his behalf, himself. The man who had once sat beside Ngozi on that bench during the difficult years had become, somewhere along the way, a man who made decisions by letting the loudest voices around him make them for him. He had not brought Amarachi home because he wanted to. Ngozi had suspected this for years, had seen in his eyes during the worst moments of that period something that looked less like desire and more like compliance. He had done it because he had been worn down by voices that told him it was necessary, and he had not had the character in that moment to protect the woman who had protected his home during the years when nobody else was watching. He had also spent 20 years not speaking a child's name. These things required accounting for. The accounting was not dramatic. There were no scenes in the compound yard of the kind that a story like this might seem to be building toward. What happened instead was quieter and in many ways more significant, a gradual process of acknowledgement, imperfect and incomplete in the ways that real acknowledgements always are, that moved through the compound like the slow return of moisture after a long, dry season. Ikechukwu spoke with Ngozi, privately, without the compound as an audience, which was the correct way to do it and the way she had always deserved. What was said between them stayed between them, as it should. But those who knew her well enough to read the small signals of her bearing noticed, in the weeks that followed, that something in the way she moved through the compound had changed, not loudly, not triumphantly, but in the manner of a person who has received something they were owed and has chosen to carry it with the same quietness they carried everything else. Chisom stayed. This was perhaps the most significant outcome of everything that had happened. She did not arrive to take anything or destroy anything. She arrived because she had the right to know her own origin, and because her mother had raised her to believe that a person's history should not be hidden from them, no matter how inconvenient that history was for others. She stayed because the compound, once it had processed its own shock, found that it could not reasonably send her away. The same elder women who had once advised Ngozi to endure now found themselves advising the family to do something similar, to absorb what had returned, and to build something more honest from it than what they'd had before. Amarachi, for her part, underwent her own private reckoning. She had arrived in that compound with the conviction that she was filling a need and solving a problem. She had been told by the relatives who orchestrated her arrival that the family required what she could provide. Nobody had told her what had been hidden in the family's past. Nobody had mentioned that the foundation she was being invited to build her future on had an unacknowledged crack running through its centre. She was not innocent of everything. She had chosen not to ask certain questions. She had positioned herself in ways that she knew were painful to Ngozi, and had told herself that this was simply how these situations worked. But she was also, in important ways, a woman who had been used as an instrument by people with their own agendas, and discovering this required her to revise not just her understanding of the family she had married into, but her understanding of her own position within it. She and Ngozi would not become friends. That is not what this story is. But they arrived eventually at the particular understanding that two women can reach when they recognize that the thing which was done to each of them was done by the same system of silence and convenience, and that the person most responsible for maintaining that system was not either one of them. It was Mama Nkechi who noticed first. Months after Chizom's arrival, on an ordinary morning when the compound was going about its daily business, Ngozi came outside and sat down on the bench at the entrance of the house. The same bench. The same position where Ikechukwu had stood with Amarachi on the afternoon that had changed everything. Ngozi sat down on it with the ease of a woman sitting in a place that belongs to her, set her cup of tea on the ground beside her feet, and looked out at the yard. She was not performing anything. She was not making a statement. She was simply sitting in a place that was hers, in the way that a person sits in a place that is theirs, with the settled quality of someone who has stopped needing to prove that fact to anyone. Mama Nkechi watched from her doorway and thought about the saying she had returned to so many times over the years, that truth inside a marriage is like water finding its level. She thought about all the times she had offered that counsel to Ngozi during the years when it must have felt like something that was easy to say and impossible to believe. She thought about whether she had been right to advise endurance, and whether the outcome they had arrived at justified what Ngozi had carried in the meantime. She did not arrive at a simple answer, because simple answers are for simple situations. What had happened in that compound over all those years was not simple. The suffering Ngozi had endured was real, and was not erased by the fact that truth had eventually surfaced. The years were not returned to her. The bench with another woman's wrapper on it remained in her memory. The shaking hands in the middle of the yard, the watching eyes, the silence of the elder women who had always told her to endure, none of that was undone. What was different now was not that the past had been corrected. What was different was that the truth had been restored to the centre of the compound's story. And Ngozi, who had always known in the deepest part of herself that she had done nothing wrong, was no longer carrying the weight of a verdict that had been issued without full information. She sat on the bench. She drank her tea, The compound moved around her in its ordinary morning way. There is a particular cruelty in the kind of humiliation Ngozi endured, not the dramatic cruelty of overt violence or obvious injustice, but the quiet cruelty of being made to feel insufficient for circumstances that were never entirely what they appeared to be. She had been judged by an incomplete story. She had been repositioned, diminished, and publicly disrespected based on a version of her marriage that omitted the very information that would have changed how everything was understood. This is what silence does inside a family. It does not simply protect those who benefit from it. It also harms those who are judged by situations that the silence has distorted. Ngozi was never the whole problem that the compound had been organized to solve. She was a woman being assessed by people who were working with incomplete information, making decisions about her future based on a past that nobody had told them the full truth of. When Chisom walked through the gate, she did not arrive as a weapon against anyone. She arrived as a fact that had been kept outside the compound for more than 20 years by the choice of people who believed that some truths could be permanently managed through strategic silence. They were wrong. The elder women who had counselled endurance to Ngozi over the years were not wrong that endurance was necessary. They were incomplete in their counsel, because endurance without truth is simply suffering with good posture. What ultimately restored Ngozi's position was not her patience alone. It was the arrival of a truth that the compound had tried to put away, and found, after all those years, that it could not. What Ikechukwu lost in that compound, beyond the specific reckonings he faced from family and from his own conscience, was something less tangible and more lasting. The version of himself that could have existed if he had made different choices during the years when he was still forming the man he would become. That man, the one who sat beside Ngozi on the bench during the difficult years and meant everything he said about what she was to him, had been overtaken by a version of himself that prioritized the management of inconvenient truths over the courage required to face them. Some of that cost could be repaid, some of it could not. And Amarachi, who had arrived in that compound with the bright confidence of someone who believed they were solving a problem, I learned the lesson that no woman entering a family's complicated history should have to learn the hard way, that the problems inside a marriage are rarely as simple as the people managing those problems claim, and that a position built on another person's incomplete story is not as secure as it appears from the outside. The compound continued. Compounds always do. They outlast the individual stories within them, absorbing each generation's particular drama into the larger ongoing narrative of a family that is always, simultaneously, falling apart and holding together. Chisom found, in the compound she had walked into as a stranger, something she had not entirely allowed herself to expect. A place. Not a simple place, not an uncomplicated welcome, but the genuine and difficult place that belongs to a person who has arrived carrying the truth of their own existence and refused to apologize for it. Mama Ugochi, who had watched the gate for so many years with an expression between anticipation and patience, relaxed into a different kind of stillness. The watching was finished. What she had been waiting for had come. Mama Nkechi continued giving counsel to younger women in the compound, but those who listened carefully noticed that something in her counsel had shifted a new nuance, a greater willingness to acknowledge that patience, while necessary, was not sufficient on its own. That what a woman carries through difficult years is not just endurance, but the slower work of staying true to herself inside circumstances that are trying to define her against her will. Ngozi continued to be exactly who she had always been. This perhaps was the most remarkable thing of all. Not that she was vindicated. Vindication is what happens when external circumstances finally align with what you already knew to be true. What was remarkable about Ngozi was that she had remained herself throughout the entire period when the compound and the circumstances and the man she had married were all conspiring to redefine her as less than she was. She had plastered walls. She had made small money stretch. She had swallowed public humiliation without crying. She had stored a name in a quiet corner of her mind and waited, without knowing what she was waiting for, because something in her understood that the compound story was not yet finished. She had not been destroyed by any of it, and that, in the end, was the truth that the compound could not argue with. The gate still stood at the entrance of the yard. The same gate that had received Ngozi's slow, uncertain footsteps on the afternoon everything changed. The same gate that had opened years later for a young woman whose name had been kept outside the compound for more than 2 decades. Gates, in compounds like this one, are not merely physical structures. They are thresholds, places where what is inside meets what is outside, where what has been kept away eventually returns, where the truth that a family has been managing finally arrives at the moment it has been building toward all along. Some things that people put outside the compound do not stay outside. Mama Ugochi had known this, and in the end, the compound had learned it too, because sometimes what people think has disappeared from a family story is only waiting for the right moment to return. And when it does, it reminds everyone that humiliation may be witnessed by many people, but truth always chooses its own day to speak. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification, because we bring to you real-life stories that will inspire you. God bless you and see you in the next video. Please don't forget to subscribe. Thank you.